So what I wanted to ask my guests, for a round of like introductions, how shocking for you are the current events? How unpredictable was for you the beginning of Trump's presidency, and also what is your first reaction to basically what we've been seeing developing on Twitter, that is becoming, like it or not, a sort of platform for global foreign policy, even with diplomacy reduced to a series of shocking attacks and insults. Um, from your perspective, how unexpected all this was, and how are you personally reacting to this series of events? I would like to start from Almut.
Right. So, well, I think my jaw is on the floor. Like my jaw has been dropping to the floor for the last few months, almost every day, for this or another reason. I also want to say, so like, there's something interesting about the most recent peace deal or emerging peace deal that Trump is having, and Rubio having these conversations with Russia about, and that is that. Not long after he was inaugurated, or in the preparation to his inauguration, when Keith Kellogg was still sort of like headlining or heading his like approach to diplomacy around Ukraine, um, they actually proposed something quite different. They said, "Oh, it's going to be, it's going to be a ceasefire, and we will defer NATO for maybe 10 or 20 years." And so that's obviously radically different from what's on the table now. And I think it's very interesting that like we can see the formation of their approach. They didn't arrive with a master plan, obviously. They arrived with lots of different plans, and he also hired a lot of quite different people into his administration. Not always the people who we were predicted to see. There are plenty of hawks in there too. Also, someone like Marco Rubio. Now, obviously, he's a slippery character who's changed his political views like skins, like a snake changes skin, again and again and again. But certainly, the things he's saying now that he's representing in this like full-throated, persuasive voice were not the things that he said not all that long ago. So it is a little unpredictable. We have already seen in just the space of a few weeks a very dramatic shift in what they're trying to do vis-a-vis Russia and involving Ukraine. Now, sort of the optimistic or the friendly take on that would be, well, they put something on the table and Russia said, you're not listening. So they listened and changed it. But I don't know if that fully explains it. I don't have particular insider insights. I occasionally get little bits and pieces, but not much. Yeah, that's really all I can say at this point. Maybe go to the next one.
Yeah, yeah. Volodymyr, I think what's going on right now goes even beyond your worst expectation about the, United States acting, throwing Ukraine under the bus this way.
Paolo, could you please repeat the question? I lost you in the middle.
Yeah, sure. I know I'm saying that I kind of expect your answer already, but what's going on right now with Trump basically shouting against Zelensky and basically almost getting to the point of asking Zelensky is to, basically step down from power. This goes even beyond your kind of most pessimist expectations, or it's kind of like leveled on them.
Well, that's something perhaps to explain about a position of a person who lives in Ukraine and who lived in Ukraine for most of my life. That's our life for decades was kind of like series of crises, right? And what I see now, it's certainly not the worst that has been happening during the course of my life. So the shock of 2022, the start of the Russian invasion, was much worse. 2014, actually, when the war started. So that's the title of our discussion is a bit misleading. The war in Ukraine is going on for 11 years. And that's also important to make this connection that what's going on right now is also an outcome of the events on Euromaidan and then the war in Donbass and before that annexation of Crimea. That's pretty clear outcomes of those developments. And in principle, the crisis in Ukraine or in the post-Soviet space goes on for decades, right? So something I think it's important to say. And well, was it shocking for me? No, it was not shocking. It's kind of like interesting, a bit surprising, but more like in the on the level of quantity or speed of the events, not exactly of the direction. In principle, there have been very good social science theories which predicted the collapse of the US hegemony since the 1970s. Immanuel Wallerstein, Giovanni Arrighi, and many, many other great authors who've been profoundly prophetic at the moment when very few people could speak about the ultimate collapse of the American hegemony, which was not evident 30, 40 years ago, especially after the 1989 and after the
okay, I'm texting Peter to see if he gets the invite.
And
okay.
What we see now is apparently the escalation of that process that was, well, have been noticeable for many, many years before. And yeah, it appears that Trump is one of the most important agents in the process. And unfortunately, Ukraine is one of the well, spaces where that process is developing in the most brutal form.
Yeah. Peter, I'm pretty sure that you share the same view as Volodymyr about this crisis as the climax of a deeply rooted crisis of the so-called post-Soviet world, and not just like as a story that starts with the 2022 invasion. Would you you have a very as I said, brutal newsletter in which you describe painstakingly every single day the developments of Ukrainian society, mobilization issues, the downfall of democracy in Ukraine during wartime, and a lot of like behind the scenes details on Ukrainian elites and the so-called civil society. So it's a very interesting perspective about something that usually doesn't get into mainstream newspapers. Right now, I guess you're also like seeing a lot of your talking points confirmed about the unsustainability of the war. For how was it like carried on these years, the last few years. How do you think that different segments of Ukrainian society will react to this current series of events? And when we talk about Ukrainian society, of course, we must divide it into different actors: civil societies, NGOs, everyday people. Do you have an idea of how this is kind of impacting Ukrainian society in different fields, of course?
Yeah, thanks, Paulo. Well, the first thing that I just wanted to say is about Trump's latest statements and so on. Is I was expecting. When Trump won, I did find it somewhat difficult to imagine that he would carry through on his promises. When all of his rhetoric of peace in Ukraine and so on. And I sort of assumed that the different more traditional members of the US foreign policy establishment that were in his government when he got elected would sort of take over with Ukraine, and Trump would focus on signaling about whatever domestic US political things were more popular in the news for his voters. So I was surprised to see him go as far as he's done, but I think that a really major role. Sorry, by the way, Paulo, maybe I think your microphone is on. Anyway, I think a major role has been played in the has been played by Zelensky's relations with Trump when Trump was in power, in particular, and in general, sort of the very complicated relationship between Ukrainian politics and U.S. politics that was exemplified by the Russiagate affair and so on. And it's quite interesting. I mean, for instance, in 2019, there was the whole event that led to Trump's impeachment in the U.S., which was his phone call with Zelensky, where Zelensky did promise him to investigate the whole, essentially what really happened with Russiagate back in 2016 in Ukraine, and which was an investigation that had already been taking place and so on, essentially to go after these Democrat Party figures in the Ukrainian political space. And Zelensky promised this, but then Zelensky did not follow through on this promise. And I think you can, and then obviously Trump got impeached to do with Zelensky and Ukrainian politics as a whole. So I think it's possible also to hypothesize that the Republican Party, no matter how enthusiastic many of its members or all of its members are about the U.S. military-industrial complex and U.S. foreign involvement, they see Ukraine as a sort of a dangerous place that has been very bad for their political, I guess, ambitions and political careers in the U.S. And that I think that's one possible explanation of what's going on now. But as far as in Ukraine, how people are reacting, I watch quite a lot of the Radio Svoboda, which is like the Ukrainian version of Radio Free Europe, and they always bring on different guests, different Ukrainian think tank people, and also Ukrainian government officials. And obviously, it's run by a very pro-Atlanticist, pro-Ukrainian, let's say, person, Vlasta Lazar, and so on. But it is interesting watching in which the way that the host is very displeased with the different answers that are given by Ukrainian officials about what to do in this new situation. They seem quite lost. I was watching yesterday, I think his Ivan Mereshko, I think his name is. He's an important government official on foreign policy. And he just had no real answer to the questions of the Radio Free Europe interviewer. She was asking him, what is Ukraine's strategy in this new situation? How are you reacting to the fact that Russia is now no longer diplomatically isolated, which was the whole aim of the Ukrainian foreign policy the past 3 years? And his answer was very silly. He just sort of said that, well, Ukraine and the US are good friends, and sometimes between friends there can be some issues, but we're still friends. And I think that's the general. There's confusion on the side of the government officials, competition to get Trump's attention. There've been different rumors that different members of Ukrainian political class have been trying. There was David Arachamia, a major figure in Zelensky's party. He went to Trump's inauguration, and some were claiming he was trying to get ahead in communication with Trump, ahead of Yermak, the head of Zelensky's presidential administration. But at the moment, I think Ukraine is mainly reacting, and there's not the ability to have much of a say in this. And then obviously plenty of Ukrainian, let's say, civil society is quite dismayed with this. But there are also plenty in the Ukrainian information space who are quite pro-Trump and hope for there to be an end to this. There's an expression, better a painful end than endless pain. And many people feel this way, even those that are quite nationalist and served in the army. And there's quite a few people in the Azov movement, for instance, who are quite pro-Trump and do want to see some kind of ceasefire, since they see the war as being very destructive. But they are definitely angry at any suggestions to return to political democracy in a way that would allow people they consider to be pro-Russian to run. They would like a ceasefire, but with a continuation of repression against their enemies. Many of them want Zelensky to go, but they definitely don't want some kind of return to the pre-2022 situation with a lot more political freedom, even though it was still very restricted. So it's I guess that's probably how I'd respond to the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, by the way, I want to keep this very informal. So apparently the tool allows us to intervene or interrupt other people. If any of you want to just say something else, feel free to talk, and it's totally fine. Davide, so again, I'm going to ask you the same questions, but also because you've been recently in Ukraine for a while, so I ask you pretty much the same from your, the field. Let's say, do you think these recent developments have been, they have met mostly shock or kind of a sense of anticipation in Ukrainian society? And I also would like you to, divide the chattering classes between, everyday people, and maybe give us like a sort of sense of what's the atmosphere there right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paolo, and thank you for everyone for being here. And a lot of many great points have been made. And my jaw is on the floor, as is Almut's jaw, and I'm completely surprised by the tempo, as Volodymyr said, with everything unraveled. And probably this kind of conclusion was to be expected by the speed in which it happened is amazing, and also the brutality, also the open threat that we are hearing right now are pretty crazy. And I've just came back into Kiev, where I'm here in Kiev right now in my flat near Maidan, and I just came back from a pretty long tour around Ukraine. I had the opportunity to visit the front line for a while and visiting many cities and refugee shelters, talking with a lot of common people, talking especially with a lot of psychiatrists. Paolo, can you maybe mute your mic for a sec? Sorry. Oh, thank you. And a lot of psychologists and therapists, and of course the negotiation, the peace process was one of the questions that I asked almost everyone. And I have to say that, as you implied in your question, the reaction was pretty different between different kinds of people. And while the urban middle class, the cosmopolitan ones, the ones that are really into following the news and looking at what's going on in the war, they are horrified. Of course, they are horrified. They were hoping, like was the Ukrainian political class, as Peter said, they were completely surprised by the turn of the event. They were thinking that they could play Trump against Putin, and they were hoping that Trump would get mad at Putin because Putin was supposed to be so stubborn, and instead the opposite happened. But a lot of other people, and especially people that live in more rural areas, and also soldiers. I haven't heard from a single. I visited just one brigade, and I spoke with like a dozen soldiers probably. But I have to say, this time, I visited just this single brigade, and I hadn't met not a single soldier saying that was interested in negotiation, was like following the day by day, and there is a general resignation amongst I don't want to say common people, but like not urban middle class people about all of this, and there is a kind of hope in some kind of peace. People are very tired. People are really tired, and sick of the war. That doesn't mean that everybody wants to like surrender to Russia. What they mean with peace is very different among people, but they are very tired, and basically they are not interested in what Zelensky is saying or Trump is saying. It looks very remote to a lot of people.
Thank you, Davide. I want to ask you something else about this. We've been seeing Trump's, saying multiple lies, but also something that cannot be debunked in a sort of like, truth or false way. It's something that can be debatable. For example, talking about Zelensky's popularity right now, Trump, he mentioned that Zelensky's popularity is about 4%. I don't know how he made up, this number, but I have also the feeling that many polls that have been quoted by, mainstream journalists, let's say, so are not exactly correct or updated. So I would like to ask you like a short opinion on that. Do you think that actually Zelensky's popularity is still high right now, as most people said, answering to Trump, or what's the status right now, do you think, of Zelensky's positions among Ukrainians?
Yeah, sure. So the issues of Zelensky popularity is extremely complex, or maybe it's just me. I don't completely grasp it. It's very difficult. As you said, polls made in war-torn countries are very unreliable. I think there are like 13, 14 millions of Ukraine that are actually displaced inside of Ukraine, outside of Ukraine. It's very hard to poll those people. And so all the polls that we are seeing have to be taken with a grain of salt. But actually, Zelensky has a popularity of 50%, probably, something like that. And I think it could be fairly accurate, maybe a little bit under 50, but I don't know. But at the same time, we are clearly seeing this popularity declining since at least 1 year and a half. It stood at the end of 22 almost at 90% Zelensky popularity, and now we are at probably half of that. And I think that Zelensky unpopularity is distrust in him is especially widespread among the same people I was talking before, the urban middle class, the more pro-European, pro-Atlanticist people in Ukraine. I find that those are the most skeptical about him, and frequently I heard from them the expression "bonevotik," which means because he didn't escape, and is a way to say in a kind of sarcastic way that the only reason why he was popular and was considered a good president is because he didn't run when the Russian invaded. But this is the first thing that the president is supposed to do. He shouldn't be celebrated because he did the thing that he was supposed to do. So, and at the same time, I still think that Zelensky is pretty popular because it's still the president of a country which is being invaded, and is a good communicator, is a good speaker. And but we have also to say that all the other polls, the political polls, the polls that try to poll Zelensky against possible opponents at the next presidential election, show him consistently losing against other candidates, especially against the former chief of the Ukrainian army, Valery Zaluzhny. And I think this is also a factor that had to be considered. Like when you talk with other journalists here in Kyiv, other people, also Ukrainian journalists that write a lot about politics, and when you talk with parliamentarians and peers and stuff, everybody considered like Zelensky basically politically dead. I have no idea if they are right, but this is what people are saying here in Kyiv. The thing that I found very interesting in the last 24 hours is that after the last Trump attacks, the most vicious one, we have seen a kind of rallying around the flag, around the president, even by some people in the opposition. Right this afternoon, some people from Poroshenko party, Poroshenko is the former president that Zelensky recently sanctioned. It's like really openly like sanctioning a are probable opponents at the next election. Even people from Poroshenko's party defended Zelensky against the attack by Trump, and even Yulia Tymoshenko basically said he is our president, he is legitimate, and nobody has the right. Only we can decide when his time is up. And so I wonder if maybe we are going to see Trump unwillingly resuscitates Zelensky political fortune, at least for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, David. Volodymyr, what? Hello?
Yeah, I was actually asking if I may intervene here.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, do it.
Just to comment on the polls, because I work with the polls. The ratings about 50 or 40% that you might have read in reaction to Trump's words are actually not about popularity. They ask people about whether you trust Zelensky, and they also ask whether you trust the government, whether you trust the Ukrainian armed forces, whether you trust civil society volunteers, and so on and so forth. And you can then analyze the dynamics of trust, how it changes year over year, and you can compare who is kind of more trustful and who is less. So when we look at this as it is not popularity, it is not approval rating, it is not the number of people who are going to vote for Zelensky. So they show 40 or 50% of trust in Zelensky, but is it much or not so much? For example, Ukrainians say that 90% of Ukrainians say that they trust in the army. Does it mean that they want to join the army? Absolutely not. What we know that actually the majority of Ukrainian males, they basically violated the requirement to update their contact data in order to be conscripted to the army. So that's the problem with interpreting those ratings and all the issues which David mentioned about the unreliability of the polls in the wartime, and that between a quarter and a third of Ukrainian pre-war population are not even covered by the polls. And those are primarily the people who are in Crimea, in Donbass, in the occupied areas, who are refugees in Russia, refugees in the Western Europe. And among those, the support for nationalism, the support for continuing the war until the victorious, and the support for Zelensky is less than in the on the territories controlled by the Ukrainian government. So if you look at the Ukraine in a broader picture, the support for Zelensky would be much smaller than projected from the polls conducted on quite limited territory and among only a part of the Ukrainian population. But even speaking about that, the interpretation of what is trust and how it is actually going to be translated into political behavior is could be very much contested. So these are not the people who are going to vote for Zelensky. If you look at the electoral polls, they show support for Zelensky up to 20%, and he's indeed losing to Zaluzhny. And the leader who is confident in his support would not sanction regularly his opposition leaders, like Poroshenko, as David talked about that. These are not the people who would necessarily defend Zelensky. And what we see right now is a kind of like rallying around the flag. I have a kind of like a strong suspicion that it's mostly about the political class and the professional middle class who is most invested in continuing the war. But not sure about the regular people, about the workers, about the poor, who've been becoming more and more dissatisfied, disappointed with Zelensky. This is what we see in our interviews we are conducting among Ukrainians from different classes. And let's recall the effect of 2022. In 2022, suddenly it became kind of like a dominant opinion that there are no more divisions in Ukraine. The whole nation has been united, and the argument that been made about Trump was made about Putin. Putin built the modern Ukrainian nation, and that effect has gone. Since 2022-2023, it has become apparent, more and more clear that it was connected to the expectations of the quick victory over Russia. It was mostly the effect of the failure of the original plan of invasion. And with the failure of Ukrainian counteroffensive in 23, the moods have started changing rapidly. And even that level of trust towards Zelensky, measured by the polls, it's also on the downward trajectory.
So can I just add something to this? Because I think it's important to look at where this is coming from. So where does this come from that Trump and his government have this weird obsession with like pushing Zelensky directly and pushing directly him out of this office that he holds now? And so I think there are two things here, two main strands here. And one of them is that, for better or worse, I won't say which, the Trump administration people are actually... Yeah, I can.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. So I think for the two strands, like where's this coming from that Trump is so obsessed with pushing on, like needling Zelensky to get out of office? And I think the two things is that on the one hand, the Trump people, he himself and some people around him, are listening to the Russians. And I don't mean that in a like sort of like good diplomatic practice listening, but they are really listening to them like a lot. And the Russian side, like Putin, they've always had this. First of all, they also personally like really dislike Zelensky. There's just something about him that grates on them. But they have this panic, which the Russians sometimes have, that they will sign an agreement with them, and then the Ukrainians will pull a like, well, there's a constitutional problem. He wasn't really, in office anymore because he hadn't held elections. And so all of this is invalid. And they feel that they might be tricked that way. So that is one of the reasons why they would like to have another person sign the agreement with them. Of course, they would also like to have a new Ukrainian political elite in power that is more pro-Russian than he has become over the course of his career. So they're also, opportunistic that way. And the other thing, the other strand is that, I think this is pretty clear, Trump and the people around him are incredible. They hold a grudge. They take things extremely personally. And they have this huge chip on their shoulder, right? Some of them, like JD Vance. And so I don't know, this is just a blip on the screen. Most of you might have not noticed or might have forgotten. But during the election campaign in the US, and this was in like September, October, Zelensky was here on one of his frequent visits, and he accompanied Kamala Harris to Pennsylvania, to a battleground state, to a weapons factory, and as if to support her election campaign. And even then people were saying, look, he's making a mistake here. Like, you don't do that in another country. And also, like, it might be a mistake because, the other guy might win, and then the other guy did win. And you could say, well, it's just a minor thing, but for the Trump people, nothing is a minor thing. And the fact that, Zelensky also didn't help them with, like his, with investigating stuff around Burisma, but also, Zelensky and the people around him, like especially, and this has been pointed out like over the last few days now, this highly mobilized, often grant funded media and sort of public discourse crowd in Ukraine, the opinion makers and discourse leaders, they had for a long time been very openly and outspokenly against Trump. Right. So like after 2020 when he left office, they, that was just one of the things that, they had like a whole bouquet of like, sort of like this is Russian propaganda, this is disinfo. And like Trump was part of that bouquet, like beating up on Trump came out of this Ukrainian, often Western funded, opinion leading middle class. And, you know, it just seems that apparently the Trump and his people hold that against Zelensky now. So there are these two things. So on the one hand, they're listening to the Russian argument, like this guy is not legitimate. And that means that any deal with him might be, you know, litigated against later. And the other thing is they don't like the guy. They have a grudge against him. And like we've seen, they're coming down like a ton of bricks on institutions and on people that they have some tiny jealous grudge against.
Yeah, I mean, G-Day Vance was pretty clear about it. Like yesterday, he released an interview. I don't remember for which outlet, in which basically he said, yeah, like the mistake of Zelensky was like speaking against Trump in public about his disagreements in the last few days, and not, you know, keeping those disagreements to the diplomatic secrecy. So basically, G-Day Vance said to journalists, you know how Trump is. He takes things personally. So there might be also this kind of like, you know, irrational grudge against Zelensky for being too outspoken, you know, even beyond the Russia Gate story. And basically, G. Vance said, you know, you made you said to Zelensky, you made things worse. And now regime change is basically our official position. And it wasn't a few weeks ago. And, you know, you've been advised badly. This is what G. Vance said. And also we've been seeing, as I said, foreign policy on a global scale being, you know, unrolled on Twitter. And a few hours ago, I was pretty impressed by seeing G. Vance shouting and insulting Niall Ferguson, that, for those who don't know, you know, is a major conservative figure, historian, who was a cheerleader for Trump until a few days ago. But he basically took completely the Trump's foreign policy wrong. And he was complaining against Trump for abandoning Ukraine. And G. Vance in public just scolded this major, powerful historian, you know, a major mainstream right-wing historian. And he said, look, you're not dealing with Biden presidency anymore, and you're dealing with something completely different. So on a very, like, you know, kind of temperamental tone, and this was kind of impressive because we definitely haven't seen something like this before. I wanted to ask Peter.
Davide. Can I just add one thing that, like, just to confirm what you just said, you and Almut, the Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, he basically said that like 3 hours ago. He said to Zelensky he had to tone down his criticism of the president, of Trump. He basically said that, like, don't speak bad about the guy. He's going to retaliate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we also don't have to lose track of this, like, you know, irrational, you know, personal grudges that are going on, and, you know, that might be kind of unpredictable. And I wanted to ask Peter something that, okay, might take hours for him to respond, but just like a quick impression. We've been speaking about for a long time about the difference between, you know, like the chattering classes online, the pro-Ukrainian activists that are, you know, on the one side, and on the other, the, you know, the actual Ukrainian society with all its fractures that Volodymyr has been mentioning, you know, short, you know, before. I wanted to ask you, like, talking about the NGOs word that Almut has been working with for years and years. And Almut has been writing about this, about Georgia, but I think she could talk about this for hours, about Ukraine too. But what can you say about the impact of, for example, like an American presidency basically saying, using kind of like typical radical leftist talking points. Like, look, we were using these agencies like USAID for basically promoting something that was not aligned to American national interests, and we were promoting something that was even like too woke in Ukraine, and basically was not attached to what we consider like a healthy debate. And yeah, basically, like Trump is using these arguments, especially G-Day events. I have to say that is coming more from like a populist background than Trump. You've been writing about this, Peter, for years and years, and so I wanted to ask you to come to the point. How true is this that basically Ukrainian so-called civil society and NGOs were kind of like influenced in their agenda by foreign aid, and specifically from American aid? And was this basically unavoidable? Was it necessary? There is some arguments to defend this kind of state of things, if it's what it was, or what's your take on this, on the effect of this particular topic?
In terms of the phenomenon of the NGO sort of ecosystem, I mean, I think it's undeniable if you look at the projects that they do in Ukraine. It's undeniable their politics. These are very political projects. I mean, one example is there's a well-known NGO called Chesno, which means like honest, and their main essentially activity is gathering lists of politically incorrect, I mean, it's the wrong term for it, but people who disagree with the militarist agenda in Ukraine. And this was long before 2022. I have friends that are quite relatively really small sort of left-wing journalists in Ukraine that were put on this list, and as like this list of traitors and so on. That's what it was called. That's what it is called. It still exists. And so I mean, this is obviously it's openly sponsored by USAID. I mean, this is not a secret, and Renaissance Foundation and so on. And I mean, there's never any question about the political stance of these organizations, and they always made it very clear that they're very much on the side of they were against the Minsk agreements, and they were for sort of military, if not a military resolution of the conflict, then at least non-implementation of the Minsk agreements. Also, just one little, this is slightly, but related to what Almut was saying about the Trump's desire to have a reliable signatory to any peace agreement, or Russia's desire for that. And it does remind me of recently there's been some discourse in Ukrainian society about the Minsk agreements. It was the 10-year anniversary of them a couple of days ago. And quite a few people noted, I mean, this is a common thing to say about the Minsk agreements, that they were illegitimate because they were not signed by the president. They were signed by Leonid Kuchma, which is the ex-president from quite a long time ago. And this was used by nationalists often as a reason why these are not, Ukraine is not, has no responsibilities under the Minsk agreements. So anyway, so I think it is that is a factor, what Almut was saying. But in terms of the grant world, so to speak, they're also very vocally anti-Trump, pro-Biden. I think that right now they just have quite a lot of, they always had quite a lot of illusions, really. I mean, people that I knew and my relatives and so on, and it's common for them to really think that Russia will collapse sometime soon. This has always been a common idea for them, and I think that's just always how they've thought. They don't really have much of a, I suppose, long-term strategy. Just these fantasies, essentially. And this is similar with, I guess, another parallel between Putin. I mean, it's not Putin, Minsk and Trump, which is that one of when there were the Minsk agreements before 2022, people didn't believe, I mean, myself included, that Russia would go to war over the implementation of these agreements if they weren't implemented. But obviously Russia did go to war. And I think many people didn't believe that Putin, that Trump would go forth on his promises to end the war in Ukraine. But he did. So I think there's a real problem in Ukraine's, so to speak, intellectual elite in terms of realistically assessing the situation. And there are plenty of people in Ukrainian society that criticize them for that. And I mean, even in Zelensky's party as well, there are plenty of people that are very anti the grant world. One example is Max Brzezinski. He's very openly critical. He's a parliamentarian from Zelensky's Seven of the People party. He's very critical of the grant community. I mean, Alexander Dubinsky, who's imprisoned now for his role in the Burisma leaks, he still is very, very critical of them. He's also from Zelensky's party, but Zelensky imprisoned him in 2023 for the Burisma affair. So there are definitely political forces in Ukraine that are willing and eager to, channel this dissatisfaction. But right now, there's not much space in the media for that. But I think things could definitely change very rapidly. And the civil society, so-called, has never really played that significant a role in the majority of people's lives. Most people either don't really know much about it, or haven't experienced much to do with it, or have some sort of annoyance with it, or they're just involved with it. And then, of course, they're very positive towards it. But yeah.
I want to jump in here because I think there's something that's personally very, very important to me in this whole, like in the revelations of the sort of things that US aid funds around the world, and in what we've known about, what's called Ukrainian vibrant civil society, what emerges is a caricature. Because the reality of organized foreign funded NGOs in Ukraine is such that the groups that Peter's just described, they are actually a very small and quite remote elite. There are all over Ukraine people and groups and activists who either yesterday or 20 years ago registered an NGO, and so today they are an NGO, or they're not. Maybe they're registered as a foundation, or they're not registered. And some of them have foreign funding and some of them don't, but most of them are not part of the discourse shaping elites. Most of them are not heard by the media. They're not meeting with embassies. Most of them are financially incredibly precarious. They might have worked, volunteered, and raised money locally, just pennies from their neighbors, for years and years and years before they ever got a grant. Some of them did that for years, and now because of the humanitarian crisis, they find themselves having access to more funding to implement humanitarian work. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Like, we should be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, a very specific kind of foreign funding has created a very specific kind of very loud and very partisan elite. But they are not representative of all of Ukrainian civil society, of all of Ukrainian NGOs. And this is also something that's very acutely felt within this community. So like one grassroots women's group that I've been working with for 10 years now in Ukraine, like they're from the southeast. They are actually now they're from a city that is now occupied. So they're all now refugees or internally displaced. And they were just toiling for years. Like nobody was interested in that city. No donors ever went there. So they just did it by themselves. And now they've, finally been able to get a bit more attention, a bit more funding to do some really good work. And they tell me when we go to these conferences, the people who treat us most arrogantly are the Ukrainian elite NGOs. The diplomats, the donors, the journalists, they're much friendlier to us, right? Like they look at us, to talk to us as equals. It's these elites that don't see us as that. And indeed, like if you met with some, sort of grassroots community groups from the South, from the East, but not necessarily in the West, like in small communities too, their politics are often very different from that elite. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Almut. I wanted to ask to Davide something like kind of quick. Like we've been talking a lot on Twitter about mobilization problems, right? And I noticed, like by your discussions with other reporters from the field, even just Italian reporters, that your impression of what's going on, differs grandly. And you've been quite pessimistic on the mood. As you said, on the field, about the average, the mean age of the soldiers, and about the morale, and about the equipment. But I've seen other journalists like kind of insisting and pushing again, that kind of like more optimist outlook. And they said, we've been on the front line too. We also talked with other soldiers, and the recruitment is not going so badly as the more pessimistic takes say. And I just wanted to ask you like something like kind of very practical, like how a journalist from Italy decides to, how do you choose which front line to visit, and how does it work? How can you get such a different, take from the field as other journalists do? Do you think there's a sort of like political activism going on in the denial of reality? And how was your experience, with Ukrainian soldiers recently? If you can tell us quickly what's going on.
Sure. Well, the main problem with war reporting is that if you're a war reporter, you write about an extremely complex thing, that it's an army, and another even more complex thing that is a war, and you write about it while looking at a very small portion of it, because even if you spend 2 weeks on the front line, you are going to visit like a very small part, especially in a war like Ukraine. You are going to visit a small part of the front line, and you're going to speak with a very small part of people. And so you could have like wildly different impression in 2 different visits to the front line. A very practical example with the war ongoing now is that if you visit a drone unit, which operates mainly from the second line, they have to, as they say, go to position like every once in a while just to make a specific operation, and then they're back in the village in the relatively safety of the second line. You will have the very different discussion from unit of infantry, of mechanized infantry, which is like manning the trenches, manning the zero line day after day. And also, if you visit like the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is is an offshoot of the Azov regiment, Azov Brigade now, and it's a military unit which is headed by the commander of the brigade is Andrei Biletsky, which is today's, I think, the most popular far right leader. Political leader. He founded the Azov movement in Ukraine, and it is a very rich unit. It receives a lot of donation. This 3rd Assault Brigade, so they attract very good volunteers, very fit volunteers, and so they have some privilege for that. They can choose more or less where to fight, how to fight. So if you talk with them, you are going to have a very different experience than if you talk with a much more standard infantry unit. And the point is that to try to understand what's going on, you have to like basically, if you can visit the front line, get your own experience, but basically also see what everyone else is writing and doing. And there are like tons of journalists that are visiting the fronts every day, and there are military analysts that spends months in the front line, which with much more access than us, sometimes with less access than us. And if you read everything, you can get a pretty clear idea of what's going on, I think. And what we are seeing now is basically what Peter wrote in his newsletter. Like it's an army that is getting older and older. It's an army that is getting more. It's getting proletarized. At the beginning of the war, a lot of middle class people volunteering to the army. Now that wave has exhausted itself, and now the Ukrainian army is recurring more and more to forced mobilization, and they tend to mobilize like poor people that lives in rural area, and older people. The mean age of the Ukrainian army now is estimated at like 45 years old, and that's the situation. But the thing I want to point out is that this army is still fighting, and they are still fighting against a superior foe, and they are losing. They are slowly losing, but they are still fighting. And meeting them, you see that they have still fighting spirit in them. And it's not an army that looks on the brink of a collapse. That's my conclusion. It's not the South Vietnamese army before the fall of Saigon. And talking about that, I just want to, if I can, Paolo, I just want to ask a question about Almut, because she made that very interesting distinction between like big elite NGO and the smaller, more community-based NGO. And I have to say, I have experienced that distinction traveling around Ukraine. Like even small town, they have their local small NGO, their local community, and the war multiplied those kind of initiatives. And basically, the entire a good portion of the internal refugee population is taken care by NGO with international help, not by the Ukrainian state. And so, what I want to ask Almut is how the politics of these two kinds of organization differs. Because I agree with you, there are differences, but I find also a lot of similarities.
I mean, I would just say that civil society, and I mean that only in the narrow sense, so like people who actually handle money and are probably registered, but even if it just applied as a narrow definition, it is so broad-based and it represents all politics. And to me, one of the interesting organizations that I work with is an organization that well, it emerged from a coalition of different organizations, but what was so interesting is that in their town there were people, you know, after the Maidan who were like very pro-Maidan, and then there were some who were like very skeptical. They weren't pro-Russian, but they were like, okay, bad things will come from this, and actually we don't like all of this nationalist stuff that's connected with the Maidan. But these women, and these were all women, but they were from different organizations, they understood that it was their duty to come together and work on the things that are important to everybody. And so I think that for most of civil society, most of the people who do this work, like solving problems for their communities, and this might be very big, broad problems like taking care of the internally displaced, or it might be very narrow problems like helping women who have breast cancer, right, and who are not getting proper support from the state. But they are primarily focused on the problem at hand that they're trying to solve. They're intelligent people who think a lot, but they don't have a lot of time to spend, you know, all day long reading, you know, like Telegram groups and channels and reading the news and analysis. Like they have problems to solve and to focus on that, and they often come away with very idiosyncratic and very fresh takes on politics. So I mean, I would caution against classifying them even as one demographic group, because they're not. They are very representative of all the diverse opinions and takes that exist in Ukrainian society. And let's not forget one thing that they have in common: the community-based groups. So like Western donors and Western diplomats and Western fans of Ukraine always go like, oh my God, Ukraine is this like vibrant civil society. Every problem there is, people just stand up by themselves and address it. But when you talk to these community-based groups, they're more like, yeah, we're doing this because for like 20, 30 years, the state just refused to do it. And somebody has to do it. Somebody has to make sure that women who have breast cancer, you know, get those like, you know, breast prostheses, or else they can't have them, right? Or if this doesn't happen in schools, we just have to do it. So there's a sense of alienation from the state and like disappointed hope from the state, and sort of this grim sort of like sense of like, you know, like if we don't do it, it's just not going to get done. So that is probably the thing that brings them together the most. And they are often like, even when like a government, see like the Kiev elite NGOs, they often stay attached and fans of this or that new president or this or that new, you know, parliamentarian or this or that new political party for a very long time, because they don't get as disappointment with their inaction and their inability to deliver goods for ordinary average people. Whereas the community-based groups, they don't have the luxury of being fans and supporting a particular politician for years and years and years, because they see how that person or their promises are just not doing anything for them. So they are, in a way, they're kind of anarchists that way. Like they are very much like, we got to take care of this ourselves because nobody's coming to do it for us. Does that make sense?
May I add
Absolutely.
something?
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Volodymyr.
Yeah, just I agree with Almut that we need to be cautionary about assessing the Ukrainian and broadly post-Soviet civil societies, and there are different organizations, different groups. But I'd also be more cautionary about claiming that they represent the whole of Ukrainian society, all the views. They represent it in a quite asymmetrical way. And, well, for example, there have been systematic studies to study the political attitudes of the civil society in quite broad understanding of the members of some organizations, those who participate in some protest events, those who participated in Euromaidan, and compare them with the attitudes of the Ukrainian society at large. And there have been very significant differences. So if Ukrainian society at large is largely social populist, conservative in certain way, the civil society is on the one hand more nationalist, on the other hand more neoliberal. And that's kind of like systematic measurement which tries to assess a broader picture, not just a small number of elite NGOs in Kyiv. And then even bigger problem is that which organizations, which sector in the Ukrainian civil society gets more resources, gets more public attention, gets more influence. And that's, well, the community grassroots groups are perhaps the least privileged in that respect. And although we may see the bigger diversity in the Ukrainian civil society in a broader sense, we also see that certain positions, certain interests are much, much stronger represented in the public sphere in politics. And that's a bit more complex problem than simply to kind of like divide them between elite and community groups.
Thank you, Volodymyr. I want to take advantage of this topic to ask you something maybe even, more deeply personal. You've been writing, for those who don't know, who are not familiar with your work yet, extensively about, the insufficient, this is how you call it, Maidan revolution, insufficient because it was not enough diverse in terms of like social representation. And you described the Maidan revolution as something started without, a sort of like external control, but that developed in a way that led the country on a sort of like ethno-nationalist development, which was already, on the table in the years before that, but definitely that accelerated. You said that, of course, this doesn't justify in any way the Russian reaction or the pro-Russian parties to take somehow a sort of like nihilist stance about Russia, for example, as the Communist Party of Ukraine, which I remember you saying that kind of killed itself because of that. And then you said that the Minsk agreements were probably the best of the worst option for Ukraine back then, and you wrote extensively on this subject of how basically left alternatives in Ukraine, even before the war, were kind of over. Social populist alternatives, left-wing alternatives that were not pro-Russian. And I want to ask you, how lonely have you felt in the last 3 years, confronting with the Ukrainian diaspora abroad, with Ukrainian left-wing intellectuals, and how lonely do you imagine to feel in the next few months when, we might see a sort of like dramatic conclusion to the war?
Well, I don't feel myself lonely at all. I don't know where even that impression comes. I mean, if speaking about the well, the left in Ukraine or in the intellectual sphere in Ukraine, that just just please don't judge based on the Twitter. The Twitter is not even the most popular social network in Ukraine, and Ukrainians mostly are on Telegram and on Facebook to a certain extent, but definitely not on Twitter. Twitter is more like to communicate with the people like you. with the Western journalists, and but much less among the Ukrainians themselves. So even on Facebook, there is a much bigger intellectual dissenting community of Ukrainian historians, social scientists, political scientists, who just speak with each other in Ukrainian and Russian language, and just extremely critical about the Ukrainian politics and about Ukrainian voices, who are kind of like, in a pejorative sense of the word, who kind of like speaking on behalf of Ukraine for the Western public sphere, but representing quite a narrow, privileged group of people, and many of them are actually outside of Ukraine. And so we communicate about the things that apparently are under radar for the Western observers, and that may create impression that just the people like me are lonely. Well, even on Twitter, you would see Marta Gavryshko, who is a young Ukrainian historian of left and feminist views, and she is very bravely speaks against Ukrainian ethno-nationalism, against Ukrainian far-right, and she professionally studies the history of Ukrainian nationalism, Holocaust, sexual violence, and her audience is getting bigger. And the number of other intellectuals, even speaking about the left in Ukraine, well, to a certain extent, the Communist Party killed itself on the territory controlled by Ukrainian government, but at the same time, on the occupied areas, they actually merged with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. They participated in the local elections organized by Russia, and the former Ukrainian communists are now in local councils in the occupied areas. Speaking about more like young, dissenting, critical left, there are underground groups in Ukraine who are working with draft dodgers and trying to kind of like to lead some revolutionary propaganda. They are more like Orthodox Marxists, and beyond the borders of Ukraine, there are anti-war left who are organizing together with their Russian comrades, Belarusian comrades. In Germany, there is, for example, a group called a Union of Post-Soviet Left, who try actively to work with the draft dodgers, with the Ukrainian men who were supposed to be conscripted but left the country, who are denied documents, and well, they're becoming active. Obviously, it's quite a small group, but still, that's one of the places where some alternative Ukrainian politics is articulated.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Of course, I want to ask this question to Peter and Davide too. What about the so-called Ukrainian voices? I was talking about, political loneliness, of course, taking for granted that, you guys mostly would like to see different alternatives to the mainstream neoliberal nationalist options given to the Ukrainian public. Peter, what about your intellectual approach to this disconnect between the mainstream Ukrainian voices often interviewed by Western, including Italian media, and the sense of society that you have from spending time on Telegram channels, talking to people from the diaspora, people in Ukraine? What's your take on this Ukrainian voices problem?
In terms of, look, I listen to quite a lot of media that is very, Ukrainian liberal nationalist media. I read quite a lot of it as well, and it can be interesting. You know, I mean, obviously they do respond to the events that are happening in Ukraine. Just they have their own very partisan take on that. So it's not like they're totally, you know, ignoring all the different events that are happening. So they're definitely, you know, I find it interesting. I mean, I guess to the question of, I don't know, loneliness, or, I mean, you know, there's plenty of interesting things to read, and obviously people to talk to. So I guess I'm not quite sure about the question, Paulo. It's how do I deal with it? I guess they exist, and you know, I've spent quite a lot of my life. I mean, my family. So I'm quite used to these sorts of the existence of these people, and you know, I think there's a lot that's quite deranged about the mindset, but I guess I'm just used to it. And as Volodymyr said, you know, I mean, Ukraine and this part of the world has been through lots of very unpleasant things, and I guess you have to take it as it is, really, and that's my approach to it. And so, you know.
Hey, talking about pro-Russian forces, you mentioned that basically even people who want, you know, Zelensky gone doesn't mean that they want to go back to the pre-2022 status quo in terms of like relatively open political market, you know, political diversity. Do you guys really think there's not gonna be a sort of like resurgence of, I don't want to call it pro-Russian forces, but like, you know, the kind of hidden part of Ukraine that would like to have a more, you know, moderate stance toward Russia, that looks to Russia with some sort of sympathy again, that might say, hey, you know, maybe our pro-Russian friends were kind of right of, you know, like not trusting Western allies. I'm simplifying a lot the topic that is way more complicated than that. But do you really think that in the case of like of a very painful, you know, peace deal, there might be in Ukrainian society this kind of like potential of a resurgence of like, you know, more peaceful forces towards Russia and Russian culture? Or do you think there's no space for that?
I think there'll definitely be attempts to use this sentiment among sort of, you know, Ukrainian electorate. There's definitely plenty of that sentiment in the Ukrainian electorate. And there'll definitely be political figures that will try and take advantage of that. You know, I'm thinking, for instance, of Alexei Arestovich, who sort of has rebranded himself as a person that wants to forge a more productive relationship with Russia. But, you know, of course, it's always very debatable the extent to which he would actually do that. And I mean, I think there are good chances that Zaluzhny, who seems, you know, in different polls, wins against Zelensky quite easily and against other figures as well. Zelensky occupies like the 3rd or the 4th place in these polls, actually, even after Budanov, according to the latest poll. But and Zaluzhny is well known for having a lot of good close friends that are from the pro-Russian camp. I mean, there's this friend of his, Kivalov, who he photographed with recently, which was the different NGO, liberal nationalists tried to make a scandal out of, because Kivalov is this, I guess you could say, pro-Russian figure in Odessa, who has left Odessa now, as I understand, but is still a local politician. And he's been close friends with Zaluzhny for a long time. And I mean, Zaluzhny himself had said lots of praise in favor of Russia's Gerasimov. Zaluzhny was trained, obviously, in the Soviet Union and alongside many Russians and so on. So I think that's also quite possible. There's lots of speculation that, you know, Zaluzhny would be a great figure to lead Ukraine to peace, because as a military man, although also with his fair share of sort of scandals around his evasion of, say, military service, let's say, but still, he would be a much better person to be the person that ends the war than Zelensky, who, especially I think among military personnel, doesn't have as much legitimacy. But so it's always very complicated. But I think that's possible. Also, just in terms of these are Azov people that I say that want a sort of end to the war, but no political democracy. I mean, I think plenty of people in Ukraine would like some more political democracy. So it's when I said that some people want this, it's definitely not the opinion of the desire of everyone. And just the last thing that I'd say is that, I mean, right now the Ukrainian government is stating that really, like, they think that elections should only take place after martial law is lifted, and then they say that martial law could remain in place for, I mean, somewhat indefinitely after the end of war, because the threat would still remain. So sometimes they say 6 months or a year or who knows how long. So they're very unwilling for there to be elections. This is also often tied to the fact that Zelensky has made some very powerful enemies in Ukraine, particularly in the business class and so on. But so yeah, it's a very complicated situation. But I think there definitely is the possibility, and in fact the likelihood, really, I think, of figures that are more cooperative with Russia to take the stage in elections. And I think that's what, I mean, obviously that's what the Russian government would like to see. And probably it's what Trump would like to see. He wants there to be a peace agreement in Ukraine. So I think it's quite possible, really.
Thank you. By the way, we're getting to the end of our conversation, but I invite any guest to ask question or to ask to participate just for a round of questions in case there is. So I don't know how actually it works for guests because this is my first Twitter space. But in case you know how to do that, please come ahead and just ask to participate. Yeah, I wanted to ask also to Davide and Almut very very quickly. To Davide in particular, what's your impression on the ground? Like, have you noticed a territorial difference between the different cities, Ukrainian cities that you've visited, in terms of openness for a post-war settlement that includes also more cooperative political force with Russia and with Russian culture? In your opinion, is there anything interesting that you have to say about this?
I certainly looked for them. Also because, as we said many times this evening, the pro-Western voices are much more easier to hear. Also, if you're a journalist, and it's very easy to get a skewed picture of the real situation because you're listening to NGO, to very national liberal types, and you get the impression that that's everyone's opinion, which is not true. And so I try to find those different voices, and especially as you said, more maybe even pro-Russian people thinking that yes, the narrative is not true. I believe what Putin said, or I'm believing a version of what he said, or I think that we must find a way to coexist with him. And I found very even really trying to look for them. I found really hard to find many of them, even in the East, and I have the impression that this war really disseminated a lot of hatred for for Putin and for Russia, as everywhere does, and and I'm sure that the coexistence option with Russia will become a political element in the future Ukrainian political framework, for sure. But at the same time, the war really changed this country, and I think the war before 22 is disappeared forever, and the war opened a bottle, let out a genie that it's not possible to put back in now.
So I think I would say I've always felt that the
Also, Almut, I'm also sorry if I interrupt you. I was also interested to hear your perspective. And again, I'm sorry if I'm simplifying a very complicated subject a lot for our listeners. What's your take on the future of feminism in Ukraine, in the case of like a sort of like a growing resentment from far right forces against Western allies, the Western betrayal? And or do you think there's enough like sort of like there's a strong society with like some sort of like social populist resistance that can counteract against that? I know it's a huge topic, but yeah, if you can also focus on this particular field.
So first of all, I would say I think the whole like either pro-Western or pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian, that was always a false dichotomy, because to me, in the 10 years that I've worked with Ukrainians, for them the question was never which outside country should we be for, but which kind of country do we live on here, right? Like it was always about the politics of the country and how the state approaches and takes care of its citizens. And in 2013-14, but also previously, in previous rounds, a really stupid and unfortunate political decision was made, which tied austerity and neoliberalism to being pro-Western, and a state that cares and takes care of its citizen with being pro-Russian. And that was just completely self-defeating. But I think to this day, like the main question before any Ukrainian today is, what kind of country am I going to live in? What kind of relations it has with the outside world is secondary to that. Although I think, I mean, it's totally not surprising that the vast majority of Ukrainians now have incredibly negative and bitter and angry feelings towards Russia. How would that not be the case? Obviously. I do want to say, though, that the surprising thing is that how long does it take before that goes away, and what does it take to go away? Like, do we have active reconciliation work, or do we just sort of wait it out? As everybody here knows, people in the former Soviet Union were very friendly and very well-intentioned towards Germans and Austrians who just, 45 years earlier conducted a war of extermination on their territory. So these things can eventually change. As for feminism and like what kind of society is Ukraine going to be after the war? And I think there are things that are true everywhere in the world in these situations, and that is that armed conflict and post-conflict periods are never good for women and never good for anyone in society who's weaker. There's like my feminist activist friends tell me that right now going to the police and making a complaint against your husband who beat you, they're basically like, what are you talking about? Like, we have other priorities now. There's also a thing where, and this is what one of my activists has formulated so clearly, there are all these veterans whom the government now really owes, right? But because they can't give them anything real, they can't give them job, they can't give them their leg back, they can't compensate them. So what they will give them instead is the thing that they can give away for free, and that is political power. And every party that's going to run an election is now going to have a lot of veterans on their list. And this is, often they said, like we've seen this before after 1914, when these veterans were elected and they were sort of put there kind of as in lieu of better things that they actually needed. And these weren't, not people who actually wanted to be or should have been in politics. So we'll see sort of this like men, and especially men who have fought, will take up this huge space in society. And the ways in which men, and especially men who have fought, project violence against women, there will be a taboo against this. And another dynamic here, and that is very specific to Ukraine, is that Ukraine has for a decade now, and even before, been embroiled in this what's called an externally led development process. Basically, the EU and others, but particularly the EU, comes to them with long to-do lists of things they have to adopt into law and implement in order to become, as good as the EU is, obviously. And unfortunately, women's rights and violence against women, fighting violence against women, are on that list too. So you may remember in 2022, a few months into the war, the EU made the momentous decision to offer actual candidacy status to Ukraine, and it gave it like 9 or 8 or 9, I don't know, big conditions that had to be met. And then there was a list of like 24 or so small conditions. And one of those small or 24 or 15, but like a large number of sort of small, supposedly small technical decisions. And one of those supposedly small technical decisions was you have to ratify the Istanbul Convention on violence against women. Because as we know, eradicating violence against women is a small technical issue, right? And out of all that long list of conditions that were given to Ukraine, that one, ratifying the convention, was done in the space of like 48 hours. That was the first thing they did. And back then, so this is 3 years ago, I wrote an article and says, listen, this is not going to work, because we can only change the position of women in society through hard work, you know, on an all societal level. These are massive political processes. There are no shortcuts. You can't just sign and ratify a convention and the thing is done. And some of my Ukrainian activist friends who are more sort of like on the elite side, they were like, no, Almut, you're not right, because like they adopted this convention because we lobbied so hard for it. And it's like, no, they ratified it because the EU told them, because you lobbied for it for years and they didn't do anything. But then some of my more grassroots hands-on working friends said, yeah, of course, like this is going to help us. Not at all, because on the contrary, they can now sort of like, you know, wipe themselves off. This is, what do you want from us? We did everything you asked for. We ratified this convention. And in fact, everything that this convention demands has remained unimplemented in these past now 2.5 years. So this is what I see going forward. And this is before we've even started talking about the fact that you have a bunch of far-right political vigilante militant groups that will now claim even more political power for themselves, which is obviously also not good news for women. But so I don't know. I mean, we do have a very interesting situation, and I think this is quite unprecedented in human history. We have a country at war that has lost something like 25% of its population that has moved abroad, and these are disproportionately women, right? We've never had a situation where mostly women, among the adults, mostly women have left. And so now we have a society where there's a lot more men in certain age groups than women. And I've been asking my friends, like, how does this affect your community? And I'm sort of like, you know, waiting for answers. Oh, like we've seen an increase in that or a decrease in that. And he said, you know what? Before the war, before all this refugee movement, there were way more women in Ukraine than men among adults, because men have a higher mortality and other reasons. And she said, so before the war, every guy, even if he was really nothing to write home about, could have not just a wife, but a girlfriend or two as well. She said, that's over now.
Thank you, Almut. Thank you. Again, I invite our listeners to ask questions right now if they want, because we are about to, you know, wrap up this conversation. We've been covering, you know, a quite wide range of topics, maybe too wide.